All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for waking up and coming here to our presentation. We're going to talk to you today about off-service rotators. So our title is Don't Forget About Us, because we often do, enhancing the educational experience of off-service rotators. We're going to tag team this talk, and we'll just quickly introduce each other and then get into it. So I'm Mike Zdradzinski. I'm from Emory University, and I run our off-service rotator program there. I've been doing it for about 2 years now.
I'm Molins. I'm at the University of South Alabama. Worked with off-service rotators for many years at my previous shop.
I'm Kystin Miller. I'm from Ohio State, and I am the lead physician for our off-service rotating residents and fellows, and have been kind of leading that curriculum for a couple years now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Carmelli. I'm one of the education faculty at UMass, and after this talk, I'm hoping to get more involved in our rotator rotation coming forward. So we did not have any rotators come and pay us to give this talk. So this is my hook. Close your eyes and imagine, if you will, you are a first year on your prelim rotation in the emergency department. You've only stepped foot in the emergency department like twice in med school, and you haven't even been down there when in your new institution. So you're running late for your first day of shift, and you have to ask to find out what zone you're in. You show up, and immediately the emergency attending's like, bed 6 is waiting for you, go see this patient. Fast forward the end of the rotation, you've been seeing patients, you haven't really been getting much feedback, you don't really know where you stand. You get your evals, post-shift evals for the month, and it says, presentation's too long, failed to give a proper differential with killer diagnosis, and did not know how to properly resuscitate a patient in the emergency department. You feel frustrated because no one coached you, and you've never had experience on how to do this before, and here you are. So in this talk, we're going to talk about how to identify the learner's goals for being on this rotation. We're then going to talk about how you can create a curriculum based on a learner's specific goals for the rotation, and then finally, how to incorporate assessment to see if they actually achieve those goals by the end.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the needs assessment. So why is this important? Ooh, that thing's like electric today. So why is this important? So in addition to identifying the best goals for your learners, seeing where the holes are that need to be filled, there are also a couple of other really big benefits. So the first person you're going to talk to when you're making your needs assessment is going to be the program director. And in my experience, when you go to them, they are excited. They are so happy that someone actually wants to talk about their residents and their experience on an off-service rotation. And they're going to almost instantly give you a bunch of ideas. Like, they've been thinking about this for a while and waiting for you to ask them what their residents' experience should be like. So not only are you going to get very good information, but you're also going to build a lot of goodwill, which will come in handy later on if you have to contact them about something not so nice, like if there's a professionalism issue or something along those lines. The next stakeholder that you might have to talk to, or really not talk to, but the next stakeholder that may have an opinion is the institution. So the School of Medicine or your hospital. They may not have a lot to say about what the rotation should look like, but maybe you can take a step back and think about the proclivities of your institution that maybe can be fixed through this curriculum. So for example, do your primary care clinics send you a lot of asymptomatic hypertensive patients? And it drives you nuts, right? Maybe this can be a learning objective. Let's teach you what actually happens to these asymptomatic patients when they show up in the ER, which is usually not a whole lot. It may not fix the problem, but it might take a small step towards that. The next one is the accreditation body. So the ACGME has a lot of opinions about how these rotations should go, and I encourage you to read the program requirements for all the programs that are rotating with you. You can do a word search, because these are like long documents, 60 pages long, right? Just word search for emergency. It usually shows up like 4 or 5 times, only one time actually referring to the emergency room rotation. And it can give you a lot of really important information. And then finally, and maybe most importantly other than the program director, is the learners. So if you already have learners who are rotating with you, ask them. Take them aside on shift and say, hey, what do you really like about this rotation? What were you hoping to get out of this that you haven't yet? And then maybe even better, if you have a hospitalist, a young career hospitalist who graduated from your program, go to them and say, hey, you have some perspective. It's been a few years. What do you wish you had gotten from the ER rotation back when you were a resident here? Maybe that can really give you some good information. So when you're doing your needs assessment and you're making your curricular goals, there are a couple of categories that you can maybe put these goals into. So the first one is, are there any particular diagnoses or kind of types of patient presentations that the program director really wants their residents to see? Maybe your internal medicine program director really wants them to get some neurology experience because they see all these strokes upstairs, but they don't know what it's like when the stroke first comes in the ER. Likewise, are there any procedures that they either hope that you will teach them or at least help them to get their numbers on? Do they just need some general information about the ER and how the ER fits into the greater healthcare system, what we can and cannot do? Or in my case, when I did my needs assessment with internal medicine, they said, look, we need to learn about EMTALA. We've heard of EMTALA. The hospital keeps telling us that it's important, but we really don't know all the nuances of it. And so we teach it to them now. And then finally, are there any specific milestones or sub-competencies that they really want to make sure we develop for their residents while they're with us, or give them feedback on so that they can use for their resident evaluation process later on? Now, there's a group that has actually already made a national needs assessment for internal medicine. They did it about 15 years ago. This was done by a group of ER academics. And what they identified is there were 3 topics that kind of nationally internal medicine programs really wanted covered in their emergency department rotations: ortho, optho, and airway management. Now, this is interesting to me because at my shop, ortho is not something that our internal medicine program director or residents want at all. I was talking to these guys, and some of them actually have, especially family medicine, for example, really wants that. So use this information, but definitely do your own local needs assessment because your needs will vary based on your local conditions. And then finally, a brief reminder that this isn't a once and done thing. We have to redo our needs assessment every 2 or 3 years because things change. Medicine is changing very quickly with the pandemic and everything since then. The hospital's needs change, the program's needs, and what the residents will come in already knowing will change. So you have to loop back every few years and redo this. I'm going to hand it over to Kystin now, and she'll talk about the curriculum.
Awesome. So once you've kind of done that needs assessment, I think that the curriculum design can fall into kind of 3 major buckets, both thinking about the clinical environment, thinking about didactics, which maybe we have traditionally not thought about for this group of learners, and then as well as your procedural education. So let's dive into each of these a little bit. Clinical shifts-wise are really just going to be very institutional dependent. There's not a lot of data published about how many shifts should rotators be doing, length of shift, area of the department, so fast tracks versus critical care versus main pods of your emergency department, not a lot published. So that is really going to be institutional dependent. But I think that the second point is really important, is kind of what are our expectations for off-service rotators in terms of volumes of patients that we should be expecting them to see. There was a study that was published that said, so on a typical 8-hour shift, if an EM PGY1 resident is seeing like 6.6 average patients per shift. On that same shift, you can expect an off-service rotator to be seeing almost half, so like 3.6 patients per shift in an 8-hour shift. That was what was reported in the study. So I think it's just important to kind of, if you're plugging these rotators into a PGY1 slot and expecting them to be kind of as productive as your traditional PGY1 EM residents, maybe that expectation is a little off the mark. And I think that that's there for a lot of reasons. Our EM interns have done a lot of probably away rotations. This might be their 2nd or 3rd rotation in the emergency department versus this is maybe the one time that these rotators have spent some time in the emergency department with us. And so I think that that makes point number 3 really important, is the importance of a clinical orientation for these rotators. So we all know that the emergency department functions very differently in terms of flow, charting, EMR, our approach to the undifferentiated patient, our differentials. It's just a very different feel than a typical internal medicine rotation might be. So making sure that we've given them that appropriate clinical orientation is super important. So let's transition to talk about didactics. I think that this is an area that the literature says that we probably historically haven't done for our off-service rotators. So I would encourage you to think about incorporating didactics for your off-service rotators, and that structure could be, a wide variety. So maybe it is asynchronous modules that you're providing your learners that kind of hit some of those high-yield topics in your needs assessment. Maybe that is having your off-service rotators attend your EM didactics, or maybe that is having some dedicated didactics for your off-service rotators. And that's actually what we do at our shop. We do 2 hours of didactics every Monday morning for our off-service rotators, taking them through some of these topics here. And what is your content going to look like? Clearly, your local needs assessment probably trumps all of this, but there have been 3 different studies that might give you some ideas. That box on the left comes from the FACEP project, which they made a kind of a model curriculum, suggested curriculum for off-service rotators. So those are some of the high-yield topics from that kind of consensus group from EM educators. That top right group is actually the study that Mike was referring to earlier, is a needs assessment of internal medicine residents and the topics that they felt most inadequately prepared to take care of while they were in the emergency department. So that's where kind of ortho, optho, airway came from. And then that bottom right is a survey of EM program directors of things that they think that rotators should take away from the rotation. So clearly, like, different stakeholders, different priorities. I would say your local kind of stakeholders and local program director feedback and needs assessment maybe trumps all of these, but if you're looking for ideas, that can be a good starting point. And the same way with procedural education and training. This comes from that FACEP study as well, where airway, EKG, Foley placement, IVs, wound management, blood draws, POCUS, all kind of came to the top of that list. But certainly kind of assessing the needs of your local program. If you have a lot of family medicine residents who are needing some splinting, needing some LAC repairs, that they're not seeing those acute visits in clinic, maybe this list looks a little bit different. So we kind of talked a little bit about clinical stuff, didactics, as well as procedural education, and I would really encourage you as you're thinking about putting together a rotator curriculum, thinking about all 3 of those elements strategically as they meet the needs of your program.
So lastly, we're going to talk about evaluations, and I think that all of our rotations and all of our curriculums are only as strong as we have our evaluation process. So things to consider. First are going to be ACGME. So if we don't know what these rotators are told they have to do, we don't know what we're going to evaluate. So kind of in the first step with the needs assessment, in the same way we do it with the evaluations, what is it that these rotators have to get out of the rotation? Are they just supposed to be there? Is it just hours that they have to count? Is it patients that they have to see? Family medicine, actually, if you look at their guidelines, they have to see 250 adult patients when it comes to acute care. And in PEDS, pediatric emergency medicine, they have to see 75. Programs are actually looking at this. They don't have their numbers, they're not going to graduate. Therefore, in their 3rd year, when they haven't met their numbers, they're going to be like knocking on your door saying, hey, they need to come back and do more shifts because they got to see patients. So if you know this ahead of time, you can also help their program out. You're the team player. Also, when it comes to PEDS, PEDS has to do 2 rotations. So that means that they're going to be with you no matter what if you're the one that's going to be in charge of the pediatric emergency medicine rotation. So knowing that can also help you staff all of your schedules as well. The next is formative versus summative evaluations. And without getting into the nitty-gritty, one's going to be learner-centered and the other one's going to be more about the overall rotation and what they've accomplished. Right? And so when you take that into consideration, you take into consideration how you're actually going to do the formatting. And the last thing is, are this going to be paper shift cards or a paper evaluation, or is it going to be electronic? And if it's going to be electronic, it's going to have a reminder, right? You're going to have to tell somebody to remember to rotate, the rotator that rotated with you, don't forget to fill it out. Make sure you have things like photographs or anything else so that they also remember. So when it comes to resident evaluation, so there's 2 types of evaluations, right? There's going to be a resident evaluation, there's going to be evaluation about the actual curriculum, and then basically your department. So when we talk about the resident evaluation, you can do a bunch of different things. So just in the same way ACGME dictates, so does their curriculum want them to see 10 strokes, 10 ACS patients, 10 fractures, And do they want just a log of patients, or do they want diagnosis or chief complaint based? So knowing that helps you too, but it also gives the resident a goal. And in the end, right, if you don't have a goal, you don't know what you're doing. Procedure evaluations. If you look at all of the logs that they actually have to do, family practice may not get fracture dislocations and procedural sedations and lacs if they're not in the emergency department. They could have an urgent care, but then again, who's really teaching them urgent care if it's not the emergency physician, right? We should be the best ones to teach them. So we gotta have a procedure evaluation as due. That's including SDOTs. In our discussion, internal medicine, they actually wanted to do a lot of airways. Well, but do they know the basics of airways? Do they know what to actually do? I mean, I understand we all have VLs now, and we can watch them do everything, and there's less trust, right? We don't have to trust them as much because we can see it, but you actually have to go through all the steps with them too. And then you have end of shift evaluations, which can actually either go through milestones, or it can actually give them something and move the needle from day to day, give them something to work on for their next shift. And then their end of rotation evaluation. In my previous shop, we had a lot of end of shift rotation cards, and then their last end of rotation eval was basically a summative of all of those, and then gave them the number of patients and or procedures that they've done, so that it's one way in one place that the program can actually just do a quick look back and be like, oh, they made the mark, I can take this out of my equation. So this is an example of one of the shift cards this is a family medicine shift card, and I know it's small. It basically says at the top, patient care, care of the acutely ill patient. That is in our realm, right? That is what we do. So this is basically taken out of them. One of the only places they're gonna get an evaluation on this will be through emergency medicine. So for rotation evaluation, this is the opportunity where you get to be told how your environment is to the outsider. Is it a welcoming place? Did you give them an orientation? Were they lost for a week and a half and they only had a 2-week rotation? And if that happens, that's your opportunity to actually make things better. You also make things better, and it's a project for your residents, but it's also better for them so that they're more comfortable to come to you or come to your attendings if they have anything that's also that they need help with. Or when they have a consult, they know where to go. If they just need gauze and they're a first year at the end of the year, they know where to get it. They're not like scrambling, making messes in your department. But that's because they rotated and because you gave them a good evaluation or you had a good orientation, right? The last thing is, again, SDOTs, and if they're actually completing the procedures and if they're actually meeting the goals. You do not know if your curriculum, whether it was written by family practice or it was written by you, if it's any good unless you have an evaluation. This is where we get the feedback that we would like and how to actually improve. So now we open it up if anybody has any questions. So, right, so because it's going to be based on theirs, the milestones are great at telling us where they should actually be on their charting. So when you look at the milestones, if you go back real quick, right there, it'll actually tell you where they should be in level 1, level 2, and it'll discuss the different things that they should actually be accomplishing throughout each of them as well.
I think that's an important point, that we should be evaluating our rotators. That thing is really electric. That we should be evaluating our rotators on their milestones, not on emergency medicine milestones. We've, even in our discussions, we've seen that happen at a few different shops where rotators are being evaluated against the EM residents. They're not EM residents, right? They're family medicine, internal medicine, surgery, whatever. Evaluate them based on where they should be. Yes, sir. curious if how your experience has been, but what I've seen is there's a lot of quiet whispering among the residents within their own program, right? So they pass the message to each other of what to expect on every off-service rotation, just like our EM residents do. And I think to fix that, you really just need to fix the expectations on shift for your rotators. So being very upfront in your orientation about what they're expected to see. We give a general patients per shift goal. Now, it's been very fraught because the number has kind of changed through institutional memory, and it tends to go up as the ER residents want them to see more and more patients. And then we have to kind of bring it back down to what's reasonable. And I also say, look, this is a range, right? Like if you're seeing a lot of critically ill patients, or if you're seeing patients that are just outside your zone that you've never seen before, it's going to take you a while, and you're not going to see as many that day, and that's okay. But I think addressing and setting those expectations up front, but then also setting expectations with our own people, and that we need to take the rotators seriously, we need to engage them, we need to push them on shift. And I think as you do that month in and month out, then that kind of institutional memory, those whispers within their own program start to change a little bit. I find for, okay.
I've also had meetings with the chief residents, like the IM chiefs and the IM program directors, and we have developed a pretty good relationship to kind of help us set those expectations. And so some of those things are, now a part of their, handbook for here's the things that you need to know essential about your EM rotation. ENT does something similar, ortho does something similar. So I think our biggest struggle for us administratively is scheduling, and so kind of setting those expectations for scheduling things up front, but having that clear communication. We set in our orientation that their goal is to see a patient per hour without seeing a patient in the last hour of their shift. We know that that's not based on the data that I told you earlier. Probably going to happen every shift, and that's okay, and we don't necessarily expect it, but we set the expectation higher than what we actually expect them to achieve, and that has kind of helped us to keep them kind of moving, and also putting some onus on our third years as well to kind of help push on shift if we need to.
So I think it's also unique because I'm at my location where I work now at USA. The off-service residents almost work harder than my intern residents in emergency medicine. They're seeing more patients, they pick up all the way to the end of the shift, and you're like, stop. You need to go home. You get to go home today, right? And so, again, it's a lot about that expectation that you do have to set up and talking with them. Yeah.
That's what I like when I see it. I believe that it's a good, as long as you set the expectations, you talk with the deputy, they're developing a rotation there for you, so you get what you get, then you get more buy-in for them and the program, and then it's good for everyone, especially also with different evaluations.
Well, thank you. This was a great discussion. We're a little bit over time right now, so thank you so much for coming.